Hey, how's it going? Welcome to another crime dive, the last one for 2022. Can you believe we're at the end of the year? My name is Crystal Sky, and if you're anything like me, you find yourself drawn to true crime cases. So that's what I talk about. If you like true crime and you also want to feel better about your makeup skills, you should totally subscribe, and let's hang out together every Tuesday where I will take a deep dive look into a true crime case while slapping on the old clown paint. Yes, as I said, the last episode of 2022. Happy New Year, y'all. I cannot believe we are already at the end of the year. This has just been really wild and bananas. Thank you so much for all of you who watch and comment and just hang out with me every week. Thank you so much. I never thought in a million years anyone would want to watch my dumb videos. I just started this, for fun. Just wanted to expand my production skills. Ran across Queen Bailey. She looked like she was having so much fun, and I decided to try it out too. And it has been a lot of fun. So thank you so much for being with me all year. And I truly do hope that next year is just wonderful and fantastic for you. Truly, I mean that. And yes, the Clarice ears are back because today's case is Christmas themed. Speaking of, how was your Christmas? I hope it went really well. Ours was totally awesome. Just a low-key Christmas with Jeff and his brother. We're very low-key. We're kind of homebodies. Please let me know how your Christmas went. How have your holidays been in general? Are you guys doing anything for New Year? I'm not really much of a New Year person. I actually struggle to stay awake sometimes, some years. So we'll see if this year if I can stay up. And as a quick reminder before we get into today's case, I will be taking next Tuesday off. Yes, I know, sorry, but I have some life stuff to take care of. But I will be back January 10th with a whole new roster of cases to go over. But I hope you will join me Thursday, January 5th for a new video series that I wanted to start. It's going to be much shorter videos. Basically, I wanted to talk about cases that are maybe happening at the moment, cases that I've come across that there's just not a lot of information out there, so it doesn't really warrant a super deep dive look. And it's going to be more on the shorter side, probably 30, 45 minutes. But yeah, there's just so many interesting things happening. I come across interesting stuff like breaks and cold cases and stuff like that, and I just thought it would be really cool to have a little video series where we can all talk about this and share links with updates and stuff. And I'm calling it, this is silly, but I'm calling it Crime Dip. So we have Crime Dive, where we do a deep dive look into cases. Well, in this video series that I'm going to do, again, it's shorter format. So we're just going to take a little dippy dip into some of these cases. Because again, they're going to be either breaks and cold cases that I've come across that there's just not really a lot of information about, cases that are currently ongoing and happening that I've been following. The Cassidy Rainwater case is one that I've been watching and listening to. And yeah, it should be really interesting. I'm definitely going to push myself to drop 2 videos a week. So that is another reason why I'm taking the first week of January off for Crime Dive. Also, hope you guys don't mind. I'm in my hoodie. It is really chilly, and you can tell that I have been wearing this hoodie nonstop because I have makeup and stuff on it. My bad. I didn't realize it looked that bad on camera. My bad. But it's cold. All right. Well, enough chitty chat. Let's talk about today's case. Like I said, it is a Christmas themed case. I came across it last Christmas and knew that if I was going to do this channel, I was definitely going to talk about it. You may or may not have heard of this case. It's pretty infamous, especially in the area where it happened. Today, we will be talking about the case of Marshall Ratliff. You may have also known this case as the Cisco Bank Robbery by Santa Claus. It's a pretty infamous case around the area. And yeah, I came across it and just thought it was pretty wild. There's a lot of stuff to get into. I was able to find a quick little fun book about this case by Tui Snyder. It's the Santa Claus Robbery. I know the cover looks kind of weird because I thought that too when I looked at it. I was like, what the heck? But this is such a good book. It's so much fun. And it's, it's short. It's 130 pages. I read it in one go. info, and there were a lot of details in here that I hadn't found, and even scouring through like newspaper articles, like I couldn't come up with like certain names. So thank you so much to this book. It really helped fill in some gaps. And yeah, I highly recommend. It's a super fun read. All right, well, today's case takes place in the 1920s, all right? This case is actually almost 100 years old, guys. It's had its like 95th anniversary this year. All right, well, there's so much to get into. Let's just dive right in, all right? So Marshall Shorty Fields Ratliff was born March 26th, 1903 in Cisco, Texas. His parents were Leroy Ratliff and Nancy Rilla Diarman Carter. A lot of articles refer to her as Rilla Carter. Or maybe it's Rhea Carter? I don't know. Marshall had one older brother named Leo Jefferson Ratliff and two sisters. One named Llewellyn M. Ratliff and another named Ella Effie Idella Ratliff. Marshall was the baby of the family. He was the youngest. Now, Nancy, his mother, ran a cafe in town called the Manhattan Cafe. She later sold it and ran another cafe called the Club Cafe in Abilene, Texas. Now, at some point in his childhood, Marshall's father disappeared from his life, and him and his siblings were primarily raised by their mother. Now, it was said in his young life, Marshall had a lot going for him. He was very handsome, very popular. His mother was well liked among town, or in town rather, and it is said that he had a really nice singing voice. Marshall married his wife, Maddie Bell Minica? M-I-N-I-C-A. I'm not sure how you would pronounce that one. But he married Maddie on October 3rd, 1921. They ended up having two sons, one named Dane Ratliff and another named Diarman Pat Fields Ratliff. Now, unfortunately, Marshall would instead find a life of crime when he was 23 years old and his older brother Lee was 26. They, along with a third man named Dillard Brooks, robbed a bank on April 5th, 1926. This bank was in the small community of Valera, located in Coleman County, 60 miles southwest of Cisco. Marshall would later say that Dillard was the initiator and coordinator of the robbery. He was like the mastermind. Marshall said Dillard had come to him and his brother Lee on April 3rd, asking if they wanted to be part of the heist. Marshall said, quote, "On last Sunday, he got me and my brother to agree to go down there with him. We left Cisco about 1:30 p.m. Monday afternoon and went to Valera. We drove through town and then back to the bank a little bit before 4 o'clock. Lee, my brother, stayed in the car." Marshall and Dillard went into the bank, where Dillard held everyone up with his guns while Marshall proceeded to loot the bank. They ended up taking $3,000, although the book I read said that they actually took off with $9,000, and they later split the reward 3 ways, so that could be where the $3,000 number came from. Marshall and Dillard then locked up the 2 cashiers, Theo Griffin and assistant cashier Ben Mitchell, into the bank's vault. Theo then tried to plead with the men and tell them yo dudes, if you lock us in here, we're gonna suffocate, we're gonna run out of air, and told them, quote, "Let me have a screwdriver. Before we can get out, you fellows can easily be across the Texas border." Marshall and Dillard then looked at each other, nodded, and then gave Theo a screwdriver. They then made their getaway. Marshall said, quote, "We got in the car and all 3 drove to Cisco. We reached Cisco about 6 p.m. We divided the money after we got to Cisco. We split the money 3 ways. Then Marshall and Lee had gone their way, Dillard his own, and he left in the company of a 17-year-old boy who actually drove Dillard to Dallas, where Dillard lived. And they probably would have gotten away with this robbery. It was a pretty clean getaway, but Marshall and Lee just couldn't stop bragging, and it's their big mouths that actually got them caught. So with their loot, the brothers hightailed it to Abilene, Texas. There were other news articles that said that they went to Whitney, Texas, but way more said Abilene. And here they freely spent their money. So they're having a good old time, but unfortunately, they had to start bragging about where all their money was coming from. And they started bragging that they had robbed the Valera State Bank over in Valera. Now, word of this spread to Taylor County Sheriff H.T.O. Barr and Deputy M. Meek. Other articles said that his name was Deputy Reeves. And the 2 officers then made a surprise arrest of the Ratliff brothers on Wednesday, April 7th. Meanwhile, news of the Valera State Bank robbery did spread, and by the evening of April 6th, the night before the Ratliffs were to be arrested, Sheriff J.A. Trammell of Coleman County had the names of not just all the robbers involved, but he also had the address of Dillard's home in Dallas. He wired officers in Dallas to let them know to arrest Dillard. When officers got to Dillard's home, they were informed that they had just missed him. He had just left to go to the drugstore. So one officer went to the drugstore to try and, meet him there, and another stayed at the home to talk with the 17-year-old boy who had driven Dillard from Cisco to Dallas. And when the officer found out that the 17-year-old boy had driven from Cisco to Dallas, he thought that was Dillard, and he proceeded to arrest him. And I guess as this officer was leaving with the 17-year-old boy, Dillard had come back, saw what was going on, and hightailed it. And I am unclear if they ever were able to track down Dillard and prosecute him. I know he slipped out of Dallas, and there were some articles that said that he had crossed the Louisiana state border. I know when I was looking up articles of when Marshall and Lee were tried for this, they were still looking for Dillard. Now, when they were arrested, Lee said nothing, while Marshall talked, and this was because his mother had pleaded with him to tell the truth. Marshall pled guilty and on May 4th was sentenced to 18 years in prison at the Texas State Penitentiary in Huntsville, and this was 300 miles from Cisco. Lee went to trial later that same month, pled not guilty, but was found guilty and sentenced to 10 years. He probably got 10 years because he was just like the getaway driver, I guess. In August of 1926, Marshall and Lee's mother, Nancy, wrote to then Texas Governor Miriam A. Ma Ferguson, who I guess was apparently notorious for handing out pardons. It is said she pardoned about 4,000 convicts in her 2 terms as governor. Nancy urged the governor to pardon her 2 sons, saying that their health wasn't all that great. And Lee's wife was also ill, and she really needed him home. And Nancy's letter must have worked, because after serving less than a year of their prison terms, both Marshall and Lee were pardoned by Governor Ferguson. Now, it is said after they were released, the brothers sort of wandered through West Texas, and it is said that they were looking for oil field work, but they were unable to find any, and there were some articles that claim that they didn't really look all that hard, so don't know about that. They eventually found their way to Wichita Falls, and here they stayed in a boarding house. Now, it is said by the fall of 1927, Marshall just figured there was no other future for him other than being a bank robber. He had tried to find oil field work, tried to find legitimate work, but he just couldn't. His past felony conviction, even though he was pardoned, still wasn't helping him out. Not too many people were keen on hiring an ex-felon, So to that end, Marshall set out to plan one last heist, okay? It was going to be a big one, and it was going to be the last one, right? That big one. So that he could, get his score and walk off into the sunset and start a brand new life. So Marshall set to planning his biggest heist ever, and his last. Now, there are some who say Marshall was planning this heist, from the day he got out of prison. Marshall decided he was going to hit the big bank in his hometown of Cisco, the First National Bank, but he knew he was going to need at least 3 men to pull it off. This was not a one-man job. The plan would be for his 3 accomplices to hold everyone hostage and keep them occupied as he, Marshall, went and, raided the vault. He also wanted the getaway car to be sitting ready for them. He wanted it parked in the side alley that ran across the side of the bank. It was one of those big wide alleys, and people used it as sort of a parking area, and he thought having the getaway car there would make for an easy escape and an easy getaway. Now, one of the men that Marshall wanted for this job, of course, was his big brother Lee. It's his partner in crime. Marshall then roped in 2 other men that he had met behind bars. They were fellow ex-cons, Robert Bobby M. Hill, who was 21. Yeah, Bobby Hill. Whoa. And Henry Helms, who was 32. And Henry had actually been pardoned by Governor Ferguson as well. Now, Henry Helms was born February 3rd, 1897 in Boonsville, Texas. Boonsville, that's a lot of fun to say. His father was John Critton Helms, and he was a minister. And Henry's mother was Martha Keyser Price Helms. I don't know a whole lot about Henry's life, just that he was the oldest of 7 siblings. He married his wife, Nettie Mae Davis, in 1915, and they had 6 children together. 4 girls and 2 boys. But Henry was said to have a pretty criminal-filled past, and he had a rap sheet for drug dealing, bootlegging, car theft, burglary, burglary, and I'm not sure how far back his rap sheet goes, but the articles made it seem like he had quite the rap sheet that went back quite a ways. On May 31st, 1926, Henry was convicted of robbery and assault in Wichita County and had been sentenced to 5 years in prison, and this is when he had met Marshall behind bars. Apparently, Henry and one other man had entered the Price grocery store and had attempted to hold up the North Fort Worth Cold Storage Company, and they failed. Now, when Henry had been arrested, he gave his name as James Wilson Helms, but when he was booked into prison, it was booked under the name Henry Helms. Maybe that was a brother or a relative's name that he was trying to use. Like I said, Henry too was pardoned by Governor Ferguson, and he was pardoned on January 10th, 1927. And like Marshall and Lee, he served less than a year. So that was Henry Helms, one of the men that Marshall had roped into this heist. There's not a lot known about the other man, Robert Hill, only what he would later say about himself. He said that when he was only a few months old, his biological father, whose last name was Foster, had passed away, and later his mother had remarried a man with the last name Hill, and that's where he had gotten that surname. He said his mother passed away when he was only 7 years old, and when he was 11 years old, he was taken to the State Juvenile Training Center in Gatesville, reportedly because he had no one to care for him. And he remained there for quite a while, I think maybe till he aged out or ran away. And in 1926, he was convicted in Eastland County of 2 counts of burglary and had been sentenced to 2 years for each count, to be served concurrently. However, somehow, when the events of today's case take place, it was listed that Robert had served out his sentence. So maybe he got out on good behavior or something and got out early. Now, Robert claimed he wasn't actually guilty of this 1926 robbery. He had just taken the fall. He was also reported in numerous articles as being named Jack Long, so I don't know if that's his real name, an alias he went by, or maybe just incorrect reporting. That's one thing that's really confusing about this case and kind of difficult to research is it's not only, older. There was a fictionalized book written about this case in the 70s by a historian, A.C. Green, and it was pretty popular, and he changed some of the names and stuff in that account. So sometimes, the names get reported as being the actual names. Now, after the men had been pardoned and they were out of prison, Henry, who, was married with children, was said to have been the only one of the men who had anywhere to go. Robert was an orphan. I'm not sure about the state of, Marshall and Lee's relationship with their mother, because I know their mother really cared for them, but I know she also didn't want them to, be criminals and stuff. She wanted them to, find Jesus and stuff like that, so maybe living with her wasn't an option. And at this point in time, Marshall and his wife, Maddie, didn't live together, and she would actually go on to marry someone else. So the men had nowhere to go, and so that's when Henry was like, hey, I know of this boarding house run by this couple, and they have no problem renting out rooms to ex-cons. This boarding house was run by the Herons. There was Francis C. Heron, who was actually an electrician, and his wife, Josephine. So Henry, Lee, and Robert followed Henry to Wichita Falls, where Henry's family and the Herons lived. Now, the Herons had known Henry for some time, at least 7 or 8 years by this point, and Josephine ended up renting out rooms to the Ratliff brothers and Robert. She also knew Marshall and Lee as Bill and Bob Cheney. The men called her Ma, and she did describe them as, quote, perfect gentlemen while they were staying with her and her husband. Quote, all the time that they lived in my house, they had the best manners I have ever seen gentlemen have. They never used bad words and never said anything out of the way. Marshall was a Christian boy, and he had been converted in Cisco. Francis said he didn't mind the Ratliffs or Robert, but they did make him a little uneasy, Henry, Henry was a different story. Josephine would later say that Henry ran a dope ring that ran between El Paso, Texas and Tulsa, Oklahoma. She claimed that Henry told her on numerous occasions that he had many doctors on this route that would peddle dope for him. Francis described Henry as a bully and someone who used intimidation and guns to get his way. Francis said that when Henry gave out an order, it was to be carried out right then and there, and if you didn't, he would just start shooting at someone's feet. Francis said, quote, you can talk about Jesse James, Cole Younger, and the other bad men. They didn't hold a candle to Helms. When Helms ordered anybody to do anything, they obeyed right now or took the chance of getting their feet shot off. Francis said that the only reason they had even opened their doors to ex-convicts like Henry and known Henry was because they were desperate for money. And it is while staying here at the Herons boarding house where Marshall came up with his last great heist. The one that was going to have the big payoff. Then he would just walk off into the sunset. And this is how he met his 4-man team. Now, since Cisco was his hometown and he and his brother were well known in the area, his mother also owned a business there and was popular, Marshall tried to take steps to sort of conceal his identity. He dyed his blonde hair jet black. Now, I guess Marshall's plan was off to a less than stellar start when Lee, who I guess was just itching to rob something, got himself thrown back in prison when he had attempted robbery in Corpus Christi. Lee's pardon was also rescinded by Governor Ferguson's successor, Governor Dan Moody. Now, since Lee was out, Marshall now had to find someone else. And this was when Henry suggested his brother-in-law, a man named Lewis E. Davis, who was 32. Now, Henry was married to Lewis's sister Nettie, and Lewis, he was not an ex-con. He was not involved in the criminal world like Henry. He was just like an average, workaday guy, but was currently unemployed and desperate to feed his family. And that was the only reason Lewis agreed to go in on this, and he did it under the condition that no one get shot. I read another few sources that said Marshall had actually roped in another man to join in on this heist. He was a known safecracker, but he had come down with the flu and had to cancel. And then some sources said that Lewis was replacing this man. So not sure, but Lewis was now part of the heist. And on Thursday, December 22nd, 1927, around 7 p.m., the men went to the Herons' home in a stolen blue Buick sedan. Now, Henry showed Ma his new sedan and told her that it was Lewis's. She later said, quote, "Helm said that he was going on the trip and that he would never come back. He told me, as he had previously done on many occasions, that if anything ever happened to him and that if he could not be located, to communicate with him at the Fox residence on the Lash lease near Moran. The Fox residence was where Lewis's other sister, Minnie, lived with her husband, Sam Fox. Josephine would also be the one who ended up making the Santa Claus outfit that Marshall would wear to the bank robbery. Although she hadn't intentionally done so, of course. So like I said, Marshall was well known in Cisco, and he had dyed his hair jet black, but he wanted to take even more measures to conceal his identity, and not with just like a handkerchief or a mask to cover his face. And that's when he noticed that Josephine was sewing a Santa Claus outfit for her husband. He was gonna put it on for Christmas for the family. Quote, "We told the boys goodbye. Marshall, who I also knew as Bill Cheney, an alias of his, went over and picked up the Santa Claus costume. He said he wanted it. I begged him not to take it. The boy was so insistent, however, and he just took it along." But Marshall only took the jacket, hat, and Santa mask. The pats didn't fit since, of course, Josephine had sewed it for her husband. Now, with his men, his weapons, and his disguise, Marshall and his gang set off for the 200-mile drive to Cisco, and they drove through the night drinking bootleg whiskey called Electra Lightning. Now, on the way, the men discussed how they were each going to spend their money after this was over. Now, when I looked up this drive today, it said it was only 121 miles, so I'm going to assume that's because, we have freeways and interstates and, other roads and more of them. And it was well after midnight on Friday, December 23rd, when they got to the oil field camp of Moran, where, again, Lewis's sister Minnie lived with her husband, Sam Fox. Now, Moran was only 15 miles northwest of Cisco, and they ended up getting to Minnie and Sam's house around 2 or 3 in the morning. Minnie said Lewis awoke her and her husband, and Sam refused to let the drunken men stay with them. But he did let Lewis borrow a tent and let him stay out in the front yard, but the other men had to camp nearby. They weren't allowed to stay on the property. Minnie said she did not see her brother again until she was cooking breakfast for the men the next day. Sam was a rancher, so he was already long gone by the time she was cooking for the men. She said Lewis's demeanor seemed normal, and he made no mention of what the men's plans were. Though the book I read said that they did tell her that they were going on some sort of bootlegging run. Now, shortly before noon that same day, the stolen blue Buick sedan pulled up on the outskirts of Cisco. All 4 men were hungover, weary, and drowsy from not a lot of sleep. Marshall was in his Santa Claus outfit. He was crouched on the floorboard. And to give the men a feel for the layout of the town and stuff like that, he had the men drive around town for a little bit. He was then dropped off a couple blocks from the bank, and it was approximately 12:45 p.m. when Marshall got out of the car and started walking down Main Street, dressed as Santa Claus. Main Street was actually called Avenue D, but all the locals just referred to the street as Main Street. Now, to said Marshall, waved to shoppers, patted the heads of kids that passed him, and really leaned into the Santa persona as he made his way to the bank. And due to the unseasonably warm, spring-like weather, the streets were even more crowded than they normally would have been. Now, I read other articles that said Marshall did not really lean into the Santa persona, that he just hurriedly and quickly tried to just walk to the bank without gaining extra attention. So we don't really know, but we do know at some point a woman asked him what department store he was with, and he just said, quote, "You'll find out soon enough." Meanwhile, Robert and the rest of the gang drove the car to that side alley and parked. Now, it is said as Marshall continued walking down towards the bank, his Santa outfit worked almost too well. Like I said, there was even more people out on the street because of the nice weather, and he just was attracting way too much attention, more than he anticipated, and he picked up the pace to try to, lose the crowd. However, there was one child he did not lose. So, 6-year-old Frances Blassingame had seen Santa enter the bank, and she hurriedly tugged on her mother's arm, like, oh my god, Mom, look, Santa just went in that bank. I want to make sure that he knows what I want for Christmas, and she wanted to go see him. Now, they were across the street. So as they crossed the street, Marshall was already in the bank. Now, once inside the building, bank employees, customers, that included 2 children, all greeted Santa, who had said at first acknowledged them and waved. Now, at the front of the bank, there was cashier Alex Spears, who was talking to a bank customer, Marion Wilson, who was a Harvard student home for the holidays. Alex had actually been one of the locals who had helped Marshall's mother petition his pardon for the governor. He was also the bank president's son-in-law. Now, behind Alex in the cashier's cage, bank teller Jewel Poe was taking a deposit from Oscar Clyett, who was a local grocer, and 2 bank employees, Frida Strobel and Vance Littleton, were working in the bookkeeping room that was located towards the back of the bank. And 2 young girls, Laverne Comer, who was 12, and MMA Robinson, who was 10, were walking from the front of the bank toward the bookkeeping room. Laverne wanted to check her savings account balance. She earned money raising calves. Now, the book I read said that they had actually already done that, and that when everything went down, Laverne and MMA were actually on their way out of the bank. Now, there were other customers in the bank as well, and it said the number of people inside of that building at that time was 16, and that was not including the robbers. So Marshall, as Santa, walked to that desk that's in the middle of the lobby where people fill out their deposits and stuff. Now Alex, he was done with Marion, then greeted Santa and was like, hey Santa, over here, I'm open. And he called out to him twice, but Marshall did not acknowledge him. And it was right at this interaction, as this was going on, that Frances and her mother walked through the doors. And right behind them was Henry, Robert, and Lewis, who practically pushed past Frances and her mother with their guns already drawn. Now, other reports said Frances and her mother came in, right after the men came into the bank and drew their guns. Henry shouted, quote, hands up, and it is official, the bank robbery was beginning. Lewis took his place guarding the door, as Robert and Henry pointed their guns at their victims, giving them orders. Each one of the men were holding at least 2 guns apiece, and Henry, brandishing his weapons, ordered Jewel and Oscar to go into the bookkeeping room, where Frida and Vance already were, while Robert covered Alex, Marion, the girls, and the others with his guns. Now, once in the bookkeeping room, all 4 of the hostages were searched for weapons by Marshall. After they were found to be unarmed, Marshall then opened a drawer that was under the counter and found a pistol that was kept there, and he took that and stuffed it in his suit. He then ordered Jewel to open the bank's vault, which was located on the 2nd floor of the building above the bookkeeping room, and it was accessed via a very steep ladder. So Marshall climbed the ladder and got out a large potato sack that looked like it could hold Santa's toys and started loading up the loot. He got $12,200 in cash and $150,000 in security bonds. So far, so good, except the bank's side door that went into that alley, so that was their exit to get to their car, had been left unguarded. Now, apparently this door must have been visible from the front of the bank, because Frances's mother, once she's inside the bank, once she takes stock of what's going on, and before anyone can really react, she pushed her daughter forward and she made a beeline for that exit. And again, this all happened right as they came in. I'm explaining it and breaking it down. It sounds like it happened in a long time, right? But this was just seconds. And before the robbers could really register, she had, taken stock of the situation, saw the exit, and boom, she pushed her daughter forward and they made a beeline for it. And they made it. Even as the robbers were shouting at them oh, stop and we'll shoot. Frances's mother didn't care. She was nah, screw you guys. And she, boom, made a beeline for it and made it out. Now, once outside, Mrs. Blassingame started just shouting and screaming oh my god, there's a bank robbery in progress, the First National Bank's being robbed, and screaming and shouting all the way to the marshals. She ran half a block to City Hall, calling for the police chief, George Emery Bitt Bedford. So like I said, she ran half a block to City Hall and screaming the whole time, right? Oh my god, there's a bank robbery going on and yada yada yada. So a lot of people heard her. Now, after she told Chief Bedford about the robbery, he, along with his assistant chief, Chief George W. Carmichael and another officer named R.T. Reddies all armed themselves and made a beeline for the bank. Now, on the way, Bedford said that he would take the front, while Reddies and Carmichael took the back, covered like in the alley. So the bank had two alleys, one that ran like behind it, and then one that ran up the side that people parked at. That's where the getaway car was. So Bedford stationed himself in front of the bank and the side alley. Carmichael stationed himself at the mouth of the side and back alleys, like where they intersected. And I don't know if Reddies was with him or if maybe he went and stood guard at like the back door. Like, he had not a lot of reports written about him, so not too sure where he was positioned. Meanwhile, inside the bank, as Marshall was emptying the cash and bonds into his sack, Henry herded Laverne and Emma May into the bookkeeping room as well. All in all, only like 5 minutes had passed since Marshall and the gang had started the robbery. Marshall, who was now finished with all of his plundering, then fired a shot off into the bank's plate glass window. Now, it is theorized that he was signaling to his gang that like he was done and they could wrap it up. And this is when Henry noticed a face pushed up against the bank's front window. So the building that the bank was in was actually an old department store, so they had like large front display windows, and they had, locked the front doors, of course, but yeah, there were still those windows. And it is said Henry at this time looked over and saw a face pressed up against the window. He fired off a warning shot towards the face, and it was returned with a shot. Now, other reports say that it was actually Marshall who had fired that shot at the face in the window, but regardless, someone shot at it. And Henry then shot several times up into the ceiling to show that they were heavily armed. Other reports claim that it was Robert who did this, but one of them fired off a bunch of shots into the ceiling to, warn them like, hey, we're armed. But it said the men were super surprised when their warning shots were then answered with a whole volley of gunfire. Like, it came out of nowhere. They were like, oh my god. And in return, all the robbers started firing off their guns, and it was just a chaotic, free-for-all, like, shooting frenzy going on from both sides, with poor employees, customers, including 2 children stuck in the middle. Now, not only were Bedford, Carmichael, and Reddies firing and, had weapons, but there was a huge crowd of people that had now gathered outside the bank and were now firing wildly off into the building. You're probably wondering, like, whoa, what? Like, what happened here? Well, earlier in the year, the Texas Bankers Association, who were sick and tired of bank robberies all throughout the state of Texas, like, seriously, there were like 3 or 4 a day, had announced a $5,000 reward to any citizen who shot and killed a bank robber as they were in the commission of their crime. Quote, but not 1 cent for 100 live ones. Great, right? It was known as the Dead Robber Reward. So when the gunfire had erupted between the cops and the robbers, numerous citizens of Cisco had gathered to join in the shooting, all hoping for a piece of that Dead Robber Reward. It was said there was even a local hardware store owner who was just like giving out guns to anyone. And yeah, when you factor all these things in, yeah, no wonder you had a whole volley of gunfire erupting now. So inside, Marshall devised a plan to use the hostages as human shields as they got to their getaway car. And that's exactly what the gang did. So Marshall told his hostages that he expected them to go with him into the car, and as a result of being used as shields, and being in the middle of this crossfire, and being shoved into the alleyway where bullets were just flying wild, numerous people were wounded. So Alex was the first one shot, and this is when he was shoved through the side door exit. He was hit in the jaw, but he managed to make a break for it and escape towards the alley that ran in the back of the bank. Now, Lewis then stepped out into the alley, thinking that he could, unleash a barrage of bullets that would clear their path. But the second he stepped out into the alley, he was immediately struck in the side, neck, and in both of his arms. He was severely wounded, but he did manage to throw himself into the vehicle. Marshall used Frida as a human shield. He wrapped his arms around her upper body, and he ordered her into the car, but she managed to twist free from his grasp as they were in the alleyway, and she escaped. She would later say at that moment, she actually feared the vigilantes more than the robbers because she saw, innocent people being hit, and she just wanted to get the F out of there. Now, it was said in some articles and in the book that I read that the trio of police officers were the only ones firing who were taking care not to just shoot off wildly. They were waiting to have a clear shot before they pulled the trigger. And it was clear they were trying their best, not to hit civilians, whereas, the crowd of random people were just firing wildly. Now, Oscar tried taking off as soon as they were in the alleyway, but he ended up being shot in the foot, but he did manage to get away. Jewel managed to escape in that alleyway that ran directly behind the bank, along with Frida. Apparently, they had both taken off like at the same time, and some dentist who was like in one of the windows above them had shouted for them to take cover in that alley. Marion was hit next in his thigh, but Marshall managed to shove him into the backseat of the getaway car, but Marion, just in like one fell swoop, just escaped out the other side of the car and made a run for it. Marshall was then shot in his leg and jaw. Other reports said it was specifically his chin, and this was as he was getting into the vehicle, so he did take some hits as he was getting into the getaway car. And Robert, along with his hostage Vance, were the last ones out of the bank. Robert attempted to use Vance as a human shield, but as soon as they were in the alleyway, Vance was able to escape, and after Robert got behind the wheel, they took off. I think the other people in the bank had like taken cover behind, desks, chairs, whatever they could as soon as the shooting had started, and they were just waiting for it to stop. But the robbers were almost thwarted. They almost didn't get away. They almost were not able to drive off. So a local cafe owner named R.L. Davis, with his gun in his hand, charged toward the car, towards Robert behind the wheel, put a gun to Robert's head, and fired. But nothing happened. R.L. had been given the gun at the hardware store, and he didn't know how to work the safety. He didn't know how to fire a gun. And so when that didn't go off, Robert just floored it and they were out. Only unfortunately, not all the hostages escaped. Poor Laverne and Emma May had been forced into the vehicle with the robbers. Emma in the back on Marshall's lap, Laverne in the front. I guess this is also when Marshall yanked off his Santa beard and his Santa hat and mask, and Emma recognized the infamous Marshall Ratliff. Like I said, he was known in his hometown. Laverne recognized him too. Her parents had actually bought the Manhattan Cafe off of Nancy's, so she was well aware of who Marshall was. Now, as the car sped down the alleyway, trying to get onto Main Street to escape, they kept exchanging fire with the crowd and police. And in the ensuing gunfight, Officer Carmichael was shot in the head. He immediately slumped over, near death. Moments later, Chief Bedford, who was rapidly firing at the car as it exited the alleyway, was shot 5 times and immediately fell unconscious. Other articles actually said that Bedford allowed himself to be riddled with bullets. He had seen Laverne and Emma be taken into the car, and he was making sure not to hit them. And as the car pulled onto Main Street and started making its way, the gunfire just continued. Citizens kept firing at them. It is said in only 15 minutes, over 200 shots were fired. And that's actually a conservative estimate. And for all those shots fired, only one did any real damage to the robbers. One bullet, allegedly fired by local oilman A.A. Hutton, hit the back tire, but the car still sped on. The book I read actually claimed the shot came from postal worker Will Coldwell, so not sure, but someone shot one of the back tires of the car, and even though it made it spin violently, so violently that the passenger door swung open and poor Emma almost flew off Marshall's lap. The car still sped on, and it wasn't until they were on the outskirts of Cisco that they would pull over the car and sort of assess the damage. And remember, the citizens were not too far behind. So they took stock of the damage. Marshall and Lewis were both shot and bleeding heavily. The tire of their getaway car was flat, and their gas tank was nearly empty. For all of the planning that Marshall did, he didn't think to plan to make sure they had a full gas tank. Now, at this point, an Oldsmobile came down the road. It was driven by 14-year-old Woodrow Woody Wilson Harris, who was out for a drive with his parents and grandma. They had come in from the local town of Rising Star to do some last-minute Christmas shopping. So when the robbers saw the Oldsmobile coming down the road, the men got out in the middle of the road, forcing Woody to stop, and Robert fired a shot into the air as Henry approached the front passenger side where Woody's 80-year-old grandma was seated and told her to get out. She ignored him and turned her head away, and that's when Henry forcefully opened the door and violently yanked this 80-year-old woman out of the car. Now, this made Woody's mother scream. Harry told her to shut up or he'd put a bullet in her, but she was panicked and unable to stop screaming. She was freaking out. Woody's father tried pleading with Henry, oh no, I can get her to calm down, please don't shoot, trying to calm everyone down. Meanwhile, Marshall put his gun on Woody and told him to, quote, get out and make it damn quick. Woody complied. Robert then assisted Woody's parents and grandma by walking them to a nearby house where they could take refuge, I guess. So Woody got out of the car, and as the robbers started transferring all their stuff into Woody's vehicle, he took that moment to take off. Now, Marshall shot at him, but even worse, the posse, that was the word that they used. It was just a collection of the townspeople and policemen who are now after these guys, was fast approaching, and they saw Woody running away, and they thought he was one of the robbers, and they started shooting at him. He would later say, quote, "Everyone from 10 to 60 was out there with a gun. They thought I was a bank robber." Luckily, Woody found cover, and his parents and grandma, along with Robert's assistants, also took cover from the gunfire, and they were okay. Now, quickly, the men got into their stolen vehicle because now the posse... I'm gonna refer to it as that because that's just so much fun to say. The posse was only like a block away at that point, firing their guns away as they approached, of course. So yeah, they had to hurry up, load their stuff, and GTFO, right? Plus, at this point, not only were they running from the townspeople of Cisco, 2 or 3 other local police forces had joined in on this. So this was a massive manhunt, and it would get bigger, just you wait. So the men practically threw Lewis into the backseat of the vehicle. He was like nearly unconscious at this point. He had been wounded really bad. Robert threw the sack of cash and bonds right next to him. Bullets started whizzing by. Robert returned fire. The posse was even closer now. A rifle shot hit Robert in his left arm, and it knocked him to the ground, but he quickly scrambled back up and got behind the wheel of Woody's Oldsmobile. But as he sat behind the wheel, it was only then that they realized Woody had taken off with the car keys. These idiots were not going anywhere. So the men, along with their 2 young hostages, because, oh yes, Laverne and Emma are still here as this is going on. They haven't gone anywhere. Got back into the Buick and took off, flat tire be damned. Left behind in the Harris's Oldsmobile was Lewis, who was unconscious at that point, and the sack of loot. Yup, the cash and bonds were also left behind. So not only did these idiots get themselves wounded, traumatize a bunch of people, they weren't even gonna get their reward. Ain't that a kick in the nuts? 6 guns would be found on Lewis. Other reports said that it was 2 pistols and 3 ammunition belts that were found on him. With the Harris family safe, the posse then requested that Woody drive Lewis to the hospital, which he did. Now, Boyce House, who was a reporter at the time and witnessed this incident and reported on it, described what happened next as the posse then continued chasing the robbers. So he said, quote, "They raced out Maine, 2 of the desperados firing back at the automobile filled with pursuers. The driver swung onto a dirt road, and his companions tossed roofing nails out to puncture the tire of the posse's machines. Then he turned into a lane, and at last out into a pasture. But as the car dashed through cactus, mesquite, and scrub oak, the growth became so heavy that further progress was impossible." He continued on, quote, "Officers and citizens poured in from all of that section of the state, and such a manhunt as West Texas had never seen before was soon in progress. Many members of the posse were on horseback or on foot as they beat their way through clumps of trees, searched high grass bottoms of ravines, and peered around borders of canyons. There came an excited shout, for one party had discovered an overcoat and blood-stained gloves. Later, citizens found a suitcase and a pile of blood-stained rags. In the suitcase were cotton and gauze, showing that the bandits had entered their enterprise with the knowledge that there might be shedding of blood, including their own." That last bit's a little, like, traumatic, huh? But yeah, that's pretty wild. Like, doesn't it sound... When I was reading these events, it sounded like this is, like, something out of a cartoon or something. Like, throwing out, like, roofing nails to puncture the tires and stuff. Like, doesn't it just sound like it's something out of a cartoon? But it's not. It's real life, and this happened. And let's remember, throughout all of this, not only is there gunfire going on, there are 2 little girls in the middle of this. So the gang had only managed to get a few miles down an Eastland County, like, back dirt road before they were finally forced to abandon the car. So here, I guess Marshall took off the rest of the Santa suit, and the robbers instructed Laverne and Emma to stay there and not look as they fled. One of the men told them, quote, "If you look, we'll shoot." The 3 men then took off on foot. Now the posse came upon the girls. They were in the backseat of the car, crying and hugging each other. Both very frightened, but thankfully not physically harmed, just mentally traumatized, right? They also pointed in the general direction the men had fled. Of course they had looked anyway. And with 1 robber taken in, the loot returned, and the girls saved, the manhunt continued for Marshall, Robert, and Henry. And they would hunt for them all throughout the rest of the day and night, continuing into the next day. And to make the search a little more difficult, that nice, unusual spring-like weather dissipated that evening, and the cold, frigid frost set in. Now, the manhunt was riddled with people wounding themselves, shooting each other, just because, there was just a lot of chaos, and we don't have, trained law enforcement officials, searching for these dudes, and everyone's armed and loaded. There was one incident where, a farmer boy accidentally mistook one of the law enforcement vehicles for the vehicle of the robber, and so, another law enforcement vehicle then started shooting at it, and it was just chaos. And it is things like this that actually aided in the men's escape. However, the good news that the girls were okay, that the loot was returned, and they had one of the robbers was definitely marred when it was announced, later that same day / early that evening, that Chief Bedford had died of his wounds. He had never regained consciousness. Now, in custody and badly wounded, Lewis at first refused to talk or say anything. One article said, quote, "Earlier in the day, Davis stated he knew only the first names of the gang and did not know where they were from. He stated he joined them in Wichita Falls, and that last night they stayed at a point near South Bend, which he refused to name. But after he was informed by a physician that he would probably die, Davis began to answer freely. He said he lived in Wichita Falls, where he has 3 children, a father and a brother. He also remarked he had worked 6 years in a glass factory, and Lewis would end up dying later that evening in a Fort Worth hospital." Now, let's go back in time a little bit here. So that afternoon, as her brother was helping rob the bank and being shot at and chased, Lewis's sister, Minnie Fox, drove into Moran to meet her son, Chester Duffield, who was coming in via train along with his wife. Now, Minnie said that she was waiting at the train station for her son and daughter-in-law when a stranger, a woman, came up to her and asked her "Oh my God, did you hear the First National Bank's being robbed?" and going on about it. Now, when this woman started talking about it, I guess red flags and a bunch of dots started connecting in Minnie's mind, and she immediately connected her brother's visit with the strange men and what was going down right now together, and I guess just after that, she just knew that her brother was involved. And I guess when she got home, Sam told her that Henry had told him that the gang was going to go 20 miles south of Cisco for a load of whiskey to take back to Wichita Falls. Remember their bootlegging run. So not sure if this is what Henry maybe told Sam Fox, what he and the men were doing there and whatnot. Now, the next morning, Christmas Eve, after Lewis had passed, Minnie was informed of this, and it said she was greatly disturbed. She was very heartbroken, even more so because she had been unable to view his body. So after news of Chief Bedford's passing spread, there were fears that there'd be a mob wanting to get at Lewis because he was a very beloved figure. So they had transferred him to Fort Worth, and that's where he had died. So like I said, Bedford was a pretty beloved figure in the area. People really liked him. He had a good reputation. So yeah, the fervor was on even more to find Robert, Henry, and Marshall. At this point, law enforcement officials from 10 different counties had joined in the hunt. And again, this is on top of citizens as well. I guess it wasn't just the news of Bedford passing. I guess people had just, had enough of bank robbers. Like I said, dude, there were bank robberies 2 or 3 times a day. When I was looking up old news articles for this story, I remember there were 3 or 4 other bank robbery stories on the same page. So people were just kind of sick of it, However, despite the massive number of people involved, despite a whole bunch of law enforcement, the men would elude capture for a week. So yeah, let's get a little bit more into the men's adventure that they had for that week. So after ditching the car and the 2 girls, Marshall, with his jaw and leg both throbbing terribly, he slept in a blackjack oak thicket that was about 6 miles south of Cisco, while Henry and Robert walked back into town, stole another car, and then returned to pick up Marshall. Now, at this point, it was the wee early morning hours of December 24th, Christmas Eve. So far, they had managed to elude capture. Now, I'm a little confused on what they did for the whole day of Christmas Eve. I'm gonna guess hiding from the massive manhunt that was taking place, which at this point included over 150 people. The book I read said that they slept through most of the day. Now, by nightfall, the trio was not doing good. Not only did the weather turn icy and cold, Robert and Marshall were wounded, Marshall severely. They were passing out from blood loss, and they had no food and no clothes suitable for the icy conditions. So, with no other options, the men limped their way back to the Fox home. Minnie said the men came to the property about 2:30 a.m. Christmas Day, December 25th. They informed her that her brother was dead, and she helped dress some of their wounds. I read other articles that said Sam Fox was also present tending to their wounds, as was their son Chester. Minnie said that Marshall was pretty quiet, except for when Henry asked him if he wanted the bullet from his leg removed. Marshall just replied, quote, "No, I have stood it this long, and I will stand it now to the end." Minnie fixed the men some coffee and gave them some food for the road that included chicken, dressing, and cake. They were leftovers from the family's Christmas Eve meal. The men then left the Fox home and drove until dawn, found a secluded, wooded area, and slept for most of Christmas Day. They continued driving throughout the night after they had woken up, again trying to dodge and escape the massive manhunt that was now on. Again, like I said, it was just growing and growing. We had like over 150 people at this point. Shortly before midnight, Henry wrecked the car near Putnam. When he tried to get off the road in a hurry, he crashed it. Apparently there was like a group of the posse that was near, and he was trying to get off the road to avoid them, and he overcorrected and crashed it into a ditch. Now, the book I read said that Henry actually crashed it when he ran into a cattle guard, and that's what crashed the car. So, with their car crash, they hightailed it on foot, and they found their way to the oil camp that was located near there, Putnam, and around midnight they went to the Wiley farm, which was owned and lived in by R.C. Wiley and his son, Carl Wiley, who was 21. The men knocked on the door, and when R.C. answered, Henry said, quote, "I've had a wreck. I need a car to take my wife to the hospital." R.C. told the men, like, "Hey, my son is actually out with our only vehicle. Like, he'll be back, but yeah, you'll have to wait for him." And that's exactly what the men did. They waited for Carl to come back home in the Dodge. And Carl would later say, quote, "They waited until I showed up at 1 o'clock. They then pulled their guns and made me accompany them." They would end up taking Carl hostage for over 24 hours. Now, when R.C. saw that his son was being kidnapped, he attempted to shoot at the truck, but all he succeeded in doing was hitting his son. Hit him right in the right arm. And at sunup, the men found a secluded pasture and slept through most of the day. According to Carl, quote, "We stayed in a pasture 8 miles north of Cisco and nearly froze. One of the robbers took my overcoat. When night fell, they drove around aimlessly, and they told Carl that they were headed towards Breckenridge, which was 30 miles northeast of Cisco. Carl later said, quote, "They carried me about the country with them all day. There were 3 in crowd, and 2 were wounded, one in the arm and the other in the leg." And after only feasting on oranges, they did not offer Carl any, of course. The men thought it would be a genius idea to sort of hide in plain sight, as it were, and head back to Cisco. And that is exactly what they did early that next morning. Robert and Henry left Marshall and Carl in the car as they walked into town, and they came back with a quilt and a blanket. They left again, and this time returned in a stolen vehicle. This is when the men let Carl go, and they took off. Carl said, quote, "We drove into the Cisco city limits. One of the robbers scouted around until he found a Ford touring car without curtains. They got in this car and left me, drove on into town. They'd actually stolen the car from a local man named Cecil Hibbert. And Carl, realizing he was in the town of Cisco, nowhere near Breckenridge, he went to the police and told him about his little adventure with the gang." So let's go back to the Foxes, all right? Let's go back to their residence after the men had left. So around 11 a.m. Christmas morning, so they had left the Fox home a handful of hours ago, officers stopped by the Fox household. They had been sent there by Cisco Mayor J.M. Williamson, and they were sent out there to look for any traces of the robbers. I don't know if there were like tips and sightings of the men in this area or what. Now, Minnie lied to the officers and said none of the men had ever been there. And around noon, Minnie, along with her son and daughter-in-law, drove to Wichita Falls. Now, while they were gone, according to many articles, Henry, Marshall, and Robert returned to the Fox residence, where Sam currently was, and they were asking for food, and I think Sam may have given them some. And then the next night, on Monday, the men returned twice more to the Fox home, but Sam wasn't there, and at this point, they had Carl with them. So Minnie, her son, and her daughter-in-law drove to Wichita Falls, like I said. They got there around 5 p.m. on Sunday, Christmas Day, and apparently she went there because she wanted to tell relatives of Lewis's participation in the bank robbery, and tell them that he unfortunately died. And this included her and Lewis's brother Shelton. She also informed Henry's wife Nettie about her husband's involvement in the robbery. And it was this information to Nettie that caused Henry's father to send a doctor, Dr. J.T. Vick, to the Fox property. Minnie said that she heard Henry's father tell Nettie that he was going to send Dr. Vick over to look after Henry. Now, at this point, I was confused on why they thought the men would be in that area. Maybe just, they wanted to go over there and see if they could find any trace of them, since they knew that was the last place they were at was the Fox property. So Dr. Vick left for the Fox home, and he was accompanied by 2 women. Josephine Heron remember? And Essie Thornton. And they left for the Fox property from Wichita Falls late Sunday. Essie was actually Dr. Vic's housekeeper, and interestingly enough, some articles actually said that her name was Mrs. Murphy. But either way, yeah, Dr. Vic, Josephine, and Essie all headed for the Fox place. Now, when the three got into the area, they asked directions from the first person they came across, which just so happened to be Sheriff of Shackelford County, Orion Biggs. He led the trio to the Fox property, where Sam was actually visiting with a friend named Claude Edwards. Now, some reports state that Henry was actually at the Fox property at this time, and he slipped out the back when he saw the sheriff and Dr. Vic in like his car come down the road. So not sure how true that is. That's just what some articles state. Because this case is so old, you know, we didn't have cell phones and cameras and stuff like that, right? So a lot of it is told via eyewitness accounts. Sometimes it's hard to get like little details straight. Now, once Dr. Vic gets to the Fox property, all five, Dr. Vic, Josephine, Essie, Sam, and his friend Claude, were all arrested. And they were placed under arrest by Sheriff Biggs for accessory after the fact. And Minnie, her son, and daughter-in-law were also arrested. Now, I believe Claude was let go when it was found out, like, hey man, I was just here visiting my friend, like, what the F? And I believe Essie was also let go when it was found out that she was just Dr. Vic's housekeeper. You know, she had just been asked, like, hey, we're gonna go on a drive by her employer, and she was like, yeah, okay. Now, Minnie eventually confessed to feeding the robbers and tending to their wounds. And though she didn't condone their actions at all, she said that she fed them and dressed her wounds because it seemed like, quote, the decent thing to do. Now, Josephine told police that she only drove to the Fox residence with Dr. Vic because she felt sorry for, quote, old man Preacher Helms, Henry's father, and just wanted to report back to his father, like, if he was there or not. She also told police that she did make the Santa outfit that Marshall used in the robbery. She also divulged Henry's other criminal enterprises, which included that dope ring. Other articles said that Dr. Vic's car had actually been tailed, like, for a while by Sheriff Biggs. And when the car stopped by the Fox residence, that's when they were all arrested. And these articles said that the Fox residence was actually already under surveillance because they thought that the men had been there. Now, everyone except for Josephine was eventually let go. She was the only one charged with accessory after the fact. Now, news spread of Carl's experience with the bank robbers, their grand theft, and based on the information that Carl provided, people were on the lookout, right? This manhunt was still going on. The trio were spotted near the oil town of South Bend, and according to House, remember Boyce House, the reporter that was there and was actively reporting on it, he said, quote, soon a posse was hot on the trail. A force of pursuers was in the little town of South Bend in Young County when a single-seated machine with 3 occupants was seen approaching. I guess the men were going to try and cross the Brazos River that was located between South Bend and Oil City. There was like a crossing there, but when they saw the posse waiting for them there, guns in plain view, I guess the men had attempted to turn around, but they were spotted. Boyce continued, quote, then, as the members of the posse scurried into their automobiles, the car whirled and rushed away. And another car chase and shootout then ensued for 2 miles. Now, among the posse was Texas Ranger Silas Cy Bradford, who I guess was a pretty, like, infamous, famous character in the area. Sheriff Foster of Young County was also among the posse that was pursuing the robbers, along with countless other civilians and officers. The posse chased the men into an oil field, where they got out of the car and hightailed it on foot. They were headed towards the oil wells and the wooded area that was beyond them. The book I read said one of their tires had actually been shot off, like so bad that the tire like had completely stripped and it was on the rim, and that's why the men had to abandon the car. Boyce said in his reporting, quote, before Bradford's car had rolled to a stop, he was out with Old Betsy, his double-barreled shotgun, an extra pair of shells in one hand. He fired and one of the men went down and stayed there. It was Marshall, since he was already wounded, and more seriously, I guess he immediately collapsed when he was shot. Other articles said that it wasn't Bradford's shot specifically that took Marshall down. It was his existing wounds, which were infected, by the way. Remember, he had a wound in his jaw. Plus, he was, tired, hungry, dehydrated, and yeah, he was down for the count at that point. Bradford immediately reloaded his gun and would later say, quote, I did not want to be caught with an empty gun if they turned and made a stand. Robert and Henry continued fleeing, firing indiscriminately over their shoulders as they did. Once again, Bradford fired and he hit one of them, and they went down, but they immediately got back up. He repeated the same thing with the other shot, and again, hit the other one, but again, they immediately got back up. And Robert and Henry escaped. Marshall was now caught, though. Now, before he was taken into custody and to the hospital, Marshall was a, quote, walking arsenal. The police confiscated 6 handguns, including the one he stole from the bank, a double-barreled shotgun, a Bowie knife, and 3 belts of ammunition. And Marshall was in pretty rough shape at this point. The wounds in his jaw left him unable to communicate because his jaw was locked. Other articles said that it wasn't due to lockjaw, it was due to the infection of the wound in his jaw. A buckshot had pierced the hinge muscle that connects the upper and lower jaw, and this was the wound that had become infected. And when Sheriff R.L. Tubb Wilson interviewed Marshall, who Sheriff Wilson knew quite well, and Marshall knew him, Marshall could only nod or shake his head and answer yes or no questions. Sheriff Wilson then asked Marshall if he knew that he was going to die. Marshall nodded. Wilson asked Marshall if he cared whether he lived or died. Marshall shook his head. He denied being leader of the gang, denied the gang was headed for Wichita Falls, denied knowing Dr. Vic, denied knowing the Foxes, and also denied that his wounds had been tended to by the Foxes. And he denied going to their home at all. And then when he was asked, quote, "Aren't you sorry that you got into this mess?" he refused to answer. Although maybe some medical attention and recuperation did Marshall some good, because by December 29th, when he was finally able to talk, the first words he said were, quote, "I am going to get well. I want to live." While in custody, he admitted that Henry Helms was one of his accomplices, but he continuously claimed that he didn't know Robert's name. Thus, he couldn't identify him to authorities. So like I said, Robert and Henry managed to escape. They escaped into those, that wooded area that was beyond the oil wells. And this area offered them, ideal concealment. It was this wooded, canyon area around the Brazos River, and there was just lots of shrubbery and trees and rocks and stuff for them to hide in. And a massive manhunt then took place that included hundreds of officers on top of civilians, the use of bloodhounds, and even the use of a small airplane. Boyce reported, quote, "Their trail was picked up, and it seemed evident that the end of the chase was not far, because the footprints were close-spaced, showing that they were wearing from the long chase, and weak from loss of blood. Marks showed that, to climb even a small rise, they had been forced to crawl. Rain and bad weather also aided in the men's escape, and also helped hide their, tracks, along with crossing the river multiple times. Because remember, they're using, bloodhounds and stuff, too, so they were trying to trip up the bloodhounds. There were also, again, this was a massive hunt, right? And so there was a lot of people looking, so people were on the lookout, and so there was a lot of numerous sightings and misreportings of the men, making it more difficult for law enforcement to really hone in on their location. Their trail was being followed, though. Law enforcement and other members of the posse, while on their trail, found 2 of their discarded ammunition belts and evidence of their feeble attempts at camping out. They had come across some parched corn that they had stolen from a cornfield, and they had roasted over a fire, and they found the remains of that. Henry at this point, I guess, was becoming delirious from his wounds. They were infected, and according to Robert, Henry kept rambling on about getting to Graham because he knew someone there. On Friday, December 30th, both Robert and Henry, wounded, made it to Graham, and they were taken into custody around 8 a.m. without incident. Apparently, they had entered town and approached a man named Sidney Hearn, and they asked Sidney for directions to a boarding house. Now, Sidney, I guess, recognized Henry as one of the men, and he immediately alerted, the city marshal and the sheriff. The book I read said that they were actually taken in when they had walked into the Texan Hotel. They went to the desk clerk, and since Henry was delirious from his infection, Robert had asked for a Mr. Fields, and when the clerk told him that there was no one there by that name, I guess he noticed their ammunition belts, knew of the manhunt on, and recognized them, and managed to summon authorities. But either way, no matter how the authorities were summoned, so the authorities were summoned, and after breaking into a feeble run, both Henry and Robert finally gave up. Now, when asked why they tried to run, Robert said, quote, "I figured we were going to be killed anyhow, on account of the bank reward. I figured it was just as well to get killed running as with our hands up." They were taken to the county jail in Eastland. They hadn't eaten in 3 days at that point. Robert was captured with 3 pistols on him. Henry had 4. Henry had been shot in his right arm, right hip, and right collarbone, while Robert had a gunshot in his left arm and in his back. Henry denied having anything to do with the bank robbery, told officers his home was in Oklahoma City, that he was married with 5 children, while Robert was said to have been, surprised he was actually taken in, he had nothing to do with it or something. Robert told officers that he had no permanent home, no family, and no friends. All in all, Chief Bedford and Officer Carmichael died of their wounds. Carmichael died on January 17th, 1928, and 6 Cisco citizens had also been wounded. There was a sheriff who lost 2 fingers and was wounded in the leg when his pistol accidentally discharged when he was running after the men. There was another person who was also wounded with a premature weapons discharge, bringing the total number of wounded to 8. All 3 men were charged with murder, bank robbery, and auto theft, and they were all held initially at the Eastland County Jail, 10 miles east of Cisco. Now, Marshall was the first to stand trial on January 23rd, 1928, as he was still recovering from his wounds. At his trial, Emma took the stand, identified him, and testified to her traumatic experience. It was said Laverne was unable to identify him without the Santa outfit, and in the end, on January 27th, Marshall was sentenced to 99 years for the bank robbery and abduction. When his sentence was handed down, Marshall said, quote, "That's no hill for a high stepper like me." However, Marshall's legal problems were far from over. Over in Abilene, Marshall was tried for Chief Bedford's and Officer Carmichael's murders, and he would go to trial for these murders on March 26th. And he was brought to trial for their murders even though no one remembered Marshall firing his gun inside the bank. He was sentenced to death on March 30th. He was to be executed via the electric chair, and as he awaited his time at the electric chair, he attempted to appeal his sentence, claiming the insanity defense. Henry was tried next on February 20th, 1928. He brought his father, who remember was a minister, his wife, his 5 children. His wife was pregnant with their 6th, and this was in order to gain, sympathy, but I guess with Henry's demeanor, unlike Marshall's, did not help him. It was said he was broody. While Marshall was described as, jaunty, Henry kept his head down, didn't make eye contact, and rather than his family providing sympathy for him or being character witnesses for him, it said people just sort of felt sorry for his family and felt sorry for his wife, his kids, that they were stuck with, such a D-bag for a husband and father. It had also somehow been determined that Henry was the one who fired the fatal shot that killed Officer Carmichael and Bedford, so he too was sentenced to death via the electric chair on February 26th. And I'm not sure why Marshall had to be transferred to Abilene to stand trial for Bedford and Carmichael's deaths. I was a little confused on that. Now, Henry tried to appeal his sentence, but it was denied. But then, when it was decreed unconstitutional to execute people who had, mental illness, Henry got the idea to plead just that. He was going to plead mental incompetence. He stopped shaving, refused haircuts, and neglected his basic hygiene. He shredded any paper that he got his hands on, including a Bible that his mother had sent him. He stared blankly ahead, stared at the guards, and, muttered in, a sing-song kind of way. And in late August of 1929, Henry was granted an insanity hearing. And I guess he had to be dragged in because he was struggling wildly. He looked unkempt and wild. He rocked back and forth once they had him seated, burst out with things like, quote, "Aye, aye, Captain," in the middle of court proceedings, and he shredded any document his lawyer handed him. His parents and wife testified in his defense, describing his, quote, "peculiar traits from infancy," testifying to what a devoted husband and father he was, but who would disappear for a few days at a time. Now, the prosecution pointed to numerous prison officials and hospital workers, who all testified that Henry was clearly faking his symptoms, especially the fact that his insanity had come on in such a quick fashion, just out of nowhere. And it took the jury only 10 minutes to determine that Henry was indeed of sound mind, and he was sent back to death row. Governor Moody denied his wife Nettie's pleas for clemency or for pardoning or just to commute his sentence from death. He refused a stay of execution, and it was because of Henry's ruse to feign insanity. And Henry was ultimately killed in Huntsville on September 6th, 1929 by the electric chair. His last meal was cabbages, sausages, tomatoes, and pie. Now, the day Henry was executed, Marshall, who remembers trying to appeal his own sentence, started acting strange, as if he were in a catatonic state. He wouldn't move, bathe, eat, or do anything at all on his own. He didn't speak, and when he did, he would utter nonsensical words. He was reported as saying, quote, "I've sinned against the Holy Ghost. Lord, have mercy on my soul." And he would just sit there. Marshall's mother filed a lunacy hearing, arguing that her son's insanity had been caused by him being on death row for all this time and seeing man after man executed. Now, the citizens of Eastland were apparently very offended that Marshall was trying to appeal his sentence, was trying to say that he was now insane or whatever. They wanted to know why he hadn't been executed like Henry. A judge then issued a bench warrant for an armed robbery charge against Marshall, and this was for attempting to steal Woody's Oldsmobile. Marshall was then extradited to Eastland County Jail from Huntsville. Now, other reports state that Marshall was transferred to Eastland because he had an appeals hearing. Either way, Marshall remained in Eastland County Jail for 25 days, and again, behaving and acting like he was in a paralyzed, catatonic state and mumbling incoherent, rambling nonsense. He was spoon-fed by 2 or 3 jailers, and thinking that he was feigning the insanity, the jailers here at Eastland decided to test Marshall and try to break his catatonic state. They gouged his eyes with their fingers, but it said Marshall didn't even blink or flinch at this. Not even once. They crossed his legs when they put him to bed every night, and all throughout the evening they would check on him to see if he had moved at all, whether he had uncrossed his legs, changed positions, or anything. He never did. They would find him in the exact same position that they had laid him in that previous evening in the morning. There was another time when 2 jailers were like holding him up, like one on each arm, and they just let him fall. And Marshall just crumpled to the concrete floor face first. I guess he didn't even try to break his fall. He didn't try to protect his face or anything. He just fell. And all of this led some of the jailers to believe, like, damn dude, like, maybe he is kind of catatonic. Maybe something did happen to him. Now, one evening on November 18th, 1929, as Marshall is in Eastland Jail, during dinner time, volunteer Deputy Sheriff Tom Alexander Jones spoon-fed Marshall his dinner like always, helped him use the bathroom afterwards, then left Marshall's cell. Unfortunately, Jones mistakenly left Marshall's cell door open. Now, moments later, like milliseconds later, Marshall was up and taking full advantage of this. He slipped from his cell, got downstairs, and retrieved a .38 caliber Colt revolver from one of the drawers of the jailer's desks. And this was when he was confronted by Jones in the stairway. Marshall shot Jones 5 times. Other articles said that he only shot him 3 times. The gun just went off 5 times. And Jones was shot in the abdomen, shoulder, and chest before another deputy, Edward Paxton Pack Kilbourne, managed to wrestle the gun from Marshall's grasp. Other reports stated that Marshall had actually accidentally discharged the gun when he was retrieving it, and that alerted Kilbourne to Marshall's presence. Marshall attempted to get the keys to the main jailhouse door from Kilbourne, and that's when a struggle ensued, and Jones joined in. The gun went off, and Jones was shot before Kilbourne could get control of the gun. These reports also state that Kilbourne pointed the gun at Marshall and pulled the trigger, but it didn't go off. Now, the book I read said that Marshall had actually gone downstairs, discovered the doors were locked from the inside, and went rummaging around inside Kilbourne's desk looking for keys, and that's when he found the gun. And after grabbing it, he went upstairs and demanded the keys from Jones, who, of course, refused. And this is when Marshall shot Jones point blank, and then the two, struggled for the gun. And I guess in their struggle, they tumbled downstairs, and Marshall was able to shoot Jones 2 more times before Kilbourne managed to, tackle Marshall and get the gun away from him. So not sure exactly the exact sequence of events, but we do know Marshall attempted to escape, some sort of struggle ensued, Jones was shot, but Marshall was taken in. After this, Marshall was stripped naked and returned to his cell, where he started up his catatonic paralyzed act again, and Jones was rushed to the hospital. Now, as news of Marshall's latest attack made the rounds, angry, frustrated citizens started gathering outside the jail in Eastland, but as news went around that oh no, they're saying Jones is likely to survive, this crowd sort of dispersed. By the next day, though, when Jones wasn't doing so hot and the news was that he was probably going to die, the crowd returned and grew even more. They began shouting quote, "We want Santa Claus" and stuff. This was a good old-fashioned lynch mob, straight up out of the wild, wild west. And by 8 p.m., an estimated 2,000 people had gathered outside of the Eastland jail. There was a lot of anger, and it reached a tipping point when about 24 men finally stormed the jail, tackled Kilbourne, took his keys, and raced upstairs. Marshall was in his cell, lying in his cot, again naked, and they dragged Marshall outside, dragged him for a block and a half to a vacant lot that was adjacent to a local theater. They moved him to a telephone pole. Someone threw up a sack for them to cover his naughty bits, and they draped a noose over his neck. They threw the rope over the guy wires and hoisted Marshall up, but the rope snapped and he dropped. Another noose was quickly found and draped over him, and he was again hoisted up, this time 15 feet into the air. Then someone said that he should be given a chance to speak, and I guess Marshall reportedly said, quote, "Let me down and I'll talk." But I guess when he was let down, I guess he wasn't really all that coherent, and someone else in the crowd shouted, quote, "Hell, he doesn't want to talk. String him up." And that is exactly what they did. It is said Marshall's last words were, quote, "Forgive me, boys." I wonder if he meant his sons. Marshall Ratliff was pronounced dead at 9:55 p.m., November 19th, 1929. Other articles said that it was at 9:18 p.m. Marshall's dead body hung there for about 20 minutes before a county judge and a justice of the peace came by and ordered the body to be cut down. I read another source that said his body was actually displayed the next day at a furniture store before a judge ordered it to be taken down. And apparently furniture stores also did caskets and stuff, and so hanging dead bodies in front of their stores and stuff was commonplace or something. Dude, there are some things about the past, specifically the Wild West as we like to call it, that are just bonkers, and lynchings are definitely up there. Marshall's family took possession of his body and arranged for a funeral in Fort Worth, and Deputy Jones ended up dying of his wounds on November 20th. At Robert's trial, he was the last one to go on trial. Remember, we still have a third member here, which this really wasn't his trial, it was more of his penalty hearing, because he was kind of going to plead guilty. So it happened on March 19th, 1928. He pled guilty to the armed robbery, testified against the others, and pointed to Marshall as the mastermind / ringleader of the whole thing. Some had thought it was Henry before this, and he went into detail about the plan that Marshall had come up with, along with describing the men's adventure, like dodging the manhunt and stuff. Like, he told them all what had happened. Robert said at one point, when he and Henry were in that canyon hiding, he said there were two members of the posse that were actually standing on a large rock that they were underneath. Yeah, they were so close. Robert tried to gain sympathy for his actions by recounting his rough childhood and how he was the quote boy who never stood the chance. And it was said that he expressed remorse, and it is said the jury took it as this was genuine remorse. He seemed, especially out compared to Robert and Henry, to show remorse and sympathy and empathy, and he was really regretful of his actions. It also helped that because he was the last one out of the bank, and Bedford and Carmichael had already been shot at that point, it was determined Robert could not have fired the fatal shots, so that worked in his favor as well. Robert testified that though he did shoot his gun, he never aimed it at any specific person. After only 40 minutes of deliberations, Robert received a life sentence, and he would actually end up escaping prison quite a few times. So he escaped the Wynn prison farm 3 times after he was sentenced. Once in September of 1928, once more in April of 1929, and again in 1931. He was recaught each time. The first time he escaped, it was only for not even an hour or something. He was quickly recaught. Other reports indicated that he actually had escaped another time, and he was actually on the run when Marshall was lynched. In 1931, Robert was tried for the murder of Chief Bedford and headed back to Eastland to stand trial. And again, not sure why. Again, this guy was a really beloved figure in the area, so it could be that they just wanted their revenge. Even though they determined that Robert couldn't have fired the fatal shots that killed him, he still went on trial for his murder. Robert once again received a life sentence, and the book I read said that Robert escaped 2 more times after this. I guess one time he left a note behind that read, quote, "If you want to find me, you will have to come to Paris, France." And again, he was recaught each time. And despite his numerous prison escapes, Robert was granted parole in 1948. Now, no one really knows what came of him after this. Rumor has it that he changed his name and lived his life somewhere in West Texas, perhaps Midland or Odessa. And it is said that he lived his life as an ordinary law-abiding citizen. The book I read said that he joined a church, got married, became a stepfather, and was an ordinary citizen for the remainder of his life. And he was granted a full pardon on August 17th, 1964. Now, the book I read also said that Robert actually wrote apology letters to Laverne and Woody. And interestingly enough, get this, it is said Robert and Woody actually stayed in contact via letters. Yeah, they became pen pals. They became such good friends that on December 23rd, 1977, on the 50th anniversary of the Cisco Bank Robbery, it is said Woody and Robert met up and hung out, but they would not divulge where they went, what they did, or anything like that. But yeah, isn't that bonkers? Now, Marshall's lynching was said to have been the last lynch mobbing ever carried out in the state of Texas. And it is considered one of the state's most infamous crimes. Boyce House, again, remember that reporter, said of it, quote, "The most spectacular crime in the history of the Southwest, surpassing any in which Billy the Kid or the James Boys had ever figured." This case was also said to have seen the largest manhunt in Texas, and no legal action was ever brought forth against any of the participants in Marshall's lynching. And no one ever collected on that dead robber reward. There is a plaque on the building that housed the First National Bank, and it commemorates the Santa Claus Robbery. And it reads, quote, "First National Bank, scene of daring Santa Claus Bank Robbery, December 23rd, 1927. During Christmas festivities, costumed Santa and 3 fellow bandits looted bank of $12,200 in cash and $150,000 in securities. They escaped through gun battle with 2 little girls as hostages. A 3-day manhunt followed. The children and money were recovered, the robbers captured, 6 persons killed, 8 injured. Later, a mob lynched Santa when he broke out of jail. Now, the first book put out about this case was published in 1958. It was written by veteran Cisco journalist J.W. Sitton, but I couldn't find it anywhere online. I'm pretty sure it's out of print, but it is considered to be one of the most, accurate account of the events, as much as this case can be. I mentioned this earlier. In 1972, author A.C. Green wrote a fictionalized book about the robbery, changing names and, adding in a lot of dialogue. Apparently, Robert was a consultant on the book, and he was good friends with the author. And I guess he signed the author's personal copy of the book, and he wrote, quote, "I hope this book will cause young men to see crime cannot pay." However, I guess Woody was not a fan of this book at all, due to all, the fictionalization within it. And when he was asked about it in 1977, he said, quote, "It's all a damned lie. I wouldn't have it in my home." Interestingly enough, Woody also befriended one of Marshall's sons, DeArmond, and Woody claimed that neither DeArmond or Robert himself were big fans of the book. I thought that was interesting. But yeah, guys, that was the Santa Claus Bank Robbery. Wasn't that bananas? Isn't that bonkers? And it's kind of funny, probably because this crime is almost 100 years old. It's kind of funny how this case is talked about. In a funny way. Look at these dumbasses that ran out of gas, and look at these idiots. You got these dumb townspeople just, firing and people getting wounded. And it's probably just because it's so old, but, I don't know, man. I was reading this and I was like, dude, this is terrible. So many people traumatized. I know in the book that I read, it is said, Laverne, still had problems with it, many decades later, and that she would probably be diagnosed with PTSD now. She would always get really nervous around the holidays, and yeah, it really messed with her. And I don't know, man, I don't think it's funny. I think it's messed up. Just because that they were lazy and they just wanted to steal money that wasn't theirs, they traumatized a bunch of people. What about Woody's grandma? I don't know. I think they're all idiots. I don't think Marshall should have been lynched up by a mob. Vigilante justice is not justice. He was gonna get his time. I personally don't believe in the death penalty anyway, but he was, gonna get the electric chair. Look, Henry got it. Marshall wasn't gonna, get off, But yeah, I don't know. Please tell me, have you heard of this case? I know it's, kind of infamous. I had never heard of it until I read about it last year, and I just really wanted to talk about it with y'all. And man, there's so many details that aren't really commonly reported on and stuff that, yeah, I just found super interesting. And this book, The Santa Claus Robbery by Tui Snyder, was really, really interesting. It helped a lot. I got a lot of the pictures I used from this book, and man, yeah, this was just a good book. It was a good read. It was lots of fun. She's a really good writer. Highly recommend. It's, like I said, it's a quick read. It's cheap, and yeah, I really liked it. Alrighty, y'all. Oh my god, that was it. We wrapped the last case of 2022. I cannot believe it. Thank you so much again for just hanging out with me. Thank you for commenting. Thank you for recommending cases to me. I promise I have a whole album. I take screenshots of every case I get recommended. I promise I'm getting to them. January should be, I'm pretty sure, nothing but requested cases. And remember, I will not be uploading next week. Sorry, mama needs a break. I've got life stuff just to deal with, but I will be back January 10th, and I hope you will join me Thursday, January 5th for my new video series that I'm going to start. Again, it's going to be a little shorter format and just going to be talking about current cases that are happening, cases that I've come across that week. And yeah, if there's any active cases or something that you're into or whatever, yeah, I'll have you guys share that down below, and hopefully it'll be cool. Alrighty, guys. I guess this is it. I guess I'll let you go. I will see you guys next year. Have a safe, wonderful, and happy new year. I really do hope that 2023 is better for all of us. We can hope, right? We can dream. And just have a wonderful, awesome 2 weeks, guys. Have a great new year. And yeah, thanks so much for hanging out with me. I appreciate you so, so much. Alrighty, guys. See you next year. Bye-bye.